effect in 2025, we will have a similar challenge to what we had this year. If they pass in 2024, but they don't go into effect until 2026, we will have the luxury of a legislative session that will be able to help us define what's going to happen, and should know by the May-June timeframe what those impacts are going to be to local governments in time for budget actions that are taken that year. Does that help?
Yeah, and I would add on to that the interesting overlap here with the legislative budget cycle, which you have these initiatives that say as practicable or the General Assembly go figure it out. Revenue is down on January 1st. They go into effect July 1st of later that year. So the timing questions here are extremely challenging from even implementation. And the different ballot proponents, I don't know if that was a sin of omission or a sin of commission, but it leaves a lot of question marks. Commissioner Lasky.
Sure.
Yeah. Oh, please, Mr. Sebesky. Then we'll go to Commissioner Lasky.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to chime in on Commissioner Pogue's question really quick. In many cases in this subject matter area and in others, the review and comment process that Legislative Council staff and the Office of Legislative Legal Services conduct is geared heavily towards these implementation questions, timelines and who will know what numbers at what points in time. In many cases, including with these proponents, answers are, well, we expect that there will be implementing legislation that's authored to establish procedures for this. And I would comment that in my tenure and looking back before my tenure of work in the General Assembly, it is common for especially an initiated measure to require implementing legislation. That doesn't mean that implementing legislation may not be challenging, to the chair's point. Like it could pose difficulties in terms of how the implementation is done, but it's not uncommon for proponents to leave the gritty implementative details to elected officials.
Commissioner Lasky.
Thank you, Lori Lasky. Actually, this kind of fits in with the last few comments, but I was curious. I know we discussed fiscal notes. That's at a state level. Is there any information provided of what the cost is going to be for local government or local jurisdiction to implement these? Some of them look to be multi-layer and could have additional impacts that way. Thank you.
Mr. Sebesky.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Commissioner Lasky, for the question. So I'll talk about two different parts of the fiscal analysis that we produce. One is implementation costs and one is revenue impacts. With respect to implementation costs, we work with organizations that represent local government in the aggregate in order to get a sense of how those implementation costs might occur on a local basis. So for example, we have an organization that represents county assessors that we work with to understand the costs for implementation by county assessors of policy changes. We have an organization of county treasurers that we work with. We have CCI and CML and the SDA and CASE and CASB and all of these other organizations that represent local government in the aggregate. We don't generally work with individual locals to fiscal summary documents will opine on there will be implementation costs for locals. If a measure goes through to the next stage of the process where signatures are being collected, we prepare a full form fiscal impact statement that, to the best of our ability, says we expect costs to fall in these bands for these local governments. So whether that's hundreds of thousands or single digit millions of dollars for implementation, or tens of thousands or less in some cases. On the revenue impact side, our model is a model that aggregates local impacts, but because local circumstances are so unique, it actually is pretty attentive to local circumstances. And so we do have the ability to attempt to identify where impacts arise. We can't do it for every single taxing district in the state because, again, there are so many and there's so many idiosyncrasies. But we in the past have, for example, said we expect this much of a revenue impact to occur to all local governments that are within this county. And then that often confuses county officials because they'll say, no, we're not getting hit to this extent. And it's because we're representing not just the county government impact, but the impact to every level of local government that is within that jurisdiction. On the school district level, we actually do this pretty darn well because we know what school district taxation circumstances look like. So again, not in the fiscal summary, but as a measure moves through the process, that is something that we're able to itemize better. And if there's an initiative that you're particularly curious about, or once we have a clearly defined set of what might be moving forward, please reach out to us and we'll do our best to help you out.
Terrific question. And I as we go into some breakout discussions, and that'd be one of the details I'm sure will come up as we are looking at this, because we've got the summary document and you had some of the figures in the summary document, but the actual fiscal analysis of the ones we want to look at today is largely complete. So we've got pretty decent information on that front available for discussion. All right, before we lose Mr. Sabetsky, final questions. Yeah, Commissioner Donis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Sabetsky. Initiative 303 is a limitation of 4% per property. And from an assessor's perspective, that's practically impossible to implement because we have a statewide assessment rate and because we have many layers of mill levy. It would require us to alter actual values. So what happens when an initiative is on the surface level or basically impossible to implement?
Mr. Sabetsky.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Commissioner Donis, for the question. I don't know, I guess is the best answer. I think that in the case of Initiative 303, this is a constitutional requirement that would apply. So in the case that this were enacted, I think that there would need to be significant changes in the way that property taxes are administered that would break a lot of assessors' current practices, though we've had constitutional amendments enacted before that have broken a lot of local government finance and required the creation of big new financial structures to handle it. Tabor comes to mind as a constitutional amendment that created the need for somebody to do my job as one example. So I'd say you're right. We also see this as being a significant departure from the way that taxes are currently administered in Colorado. I expect that Initiative 303 would be an expensive and difficult constitutional requirement to administer. But I also would expect that if voters saw fit to put this measure in the Constitution, that local governments and the state government would probably need to find a way to make it administrable.
All right, any final questions for Mr. Sabetsky? Anybody online? Any of the folks remote? All right, well, we made it by the deadline, it looks like, to get you on to your additional duties this afternoon. Mr. Hanson, thank you as well. So with that, let's go ahead and wrap up this portion, which was meant to be a summary overview, kind of Q&A of what we see at the title board and what stages those things are progressing through that process. What I would suggest at this point is to kind of allow us to dig in together into some of the detail, hear each other out. I think we had really good luck with kind of that breakout format in the past. I would suggest that we do that again, maybe 30, 40 minutes to break into groups. Start discussing again, my suggestion is that you focus on the initiatives that you see on page 1, 2, and the top of 3. So things that are more mature through the process. The things that you're seeing on page 3 to 5, I would suggest we take those up at our subsequent meeting as we get a little more information from the title board and what we think is going to continue in the process. So that would be my ask for our small groups. I think if it's all right with Keystone, we'll do the same groups as we had before. Does that sound like an easy way to do that, to have some discussion? Commissioner Pogue.
Mr. Chair, if I might just respectfully ask if it's possible to have this discussion as a large group. I just think this group brings such different knowledge of different areas that losing any of those perspectives in small group might make it difficult for us to make good recommendations.
Well, I agree. My thought here is that we take half hour for small group discussion to kind of get things started, but that we would come back and have a full group discussion to build on that. So it was just really a chance to kind of get ideas flowing in a smaller group setting and then come back together to share out some of our main points of discussion. But I'm flexible on that, but that was kind of what I was thinking for this afternoon. Yes, Commissioner Terry.
Thank you very much. Aside from the fact that I really am not looking forward to walking anywhere, I would have to agree with Commissioner Pogue in that I think we are not a shy group. And so I think getting hearing what other people have to say is so helpful because if I hear from the schools, I understand it better and assessors. So I'm going to echo my colleague, Commissioner Pogue's request.
All right, thank you, Commissioner Terry. Any other preference? Happy to do whatever the commission would like. I just thought it'd be nice to be able to sit in a round table and see each other for a few minutes and start the conversation. But let's hear from Keystone. Trace.
Sounds like folks are voicing. I wonder if we just quickly move to a quick hand raise. If you'd rather keep it full group and have a discussion here, let us know. And if you'd rather go to breakouts, let us know. Are you comfortable with that, Sarah Hansen?
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay.
Quick temperature check, as it were.
Temperature check. If you'd rather keep it full group and we can move into that discussion now, go ahead and raise your hand. And if you'd rather go into breakouts, raise your hand. All right, got two for breakouts, majority for full group. So
I saw some abstentions.
Saw some.
Let's nip that in the bud right now, everybody.
No abstentions allowed. All right, we'll do a revote. If you would rather keep it full group, Mr. Becker, go ahead and make the call. Let's just do that. I'm bad at just a quick roll call. You got the list? Can't do that. Too formal. Robert, raise your hand. If you would like to keep it full group, go ahead and raise your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And you want to go small group, raise your hand. 1, 2. Okay. Oh, 3 online. 8, 9, 10, 11. Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4.
We have our answer.
We have our answer.
Very good. Thanks, everybody. All right. Well,
full group.
Yeah. All right. That sounds good.
So I think we can still lean in, Senator Hansen, if you'd like us to help kind of facilitate the discussion. So with the suggestion of moving, I think looked like everybody was comfortable with the kind of going on the pages 1 through 3. Does anybody have any objections that they would rather go to the ones that are not as baked? Okay. So I think the easiest way we were thinking about this is kind of the question of strengths. What do you like? What do you see that is working for you? And then kind of concerns, challenges side. And I think that we can all just kind of bounce off of one another and we'll just keep it moving through each of these initiatives. Does that sound good to folks? All right. And we'll capture that as well for the notes, but really just want to open it up for discussion. And so for the folks online too, I'm going to keep kind of moving my head around. So if you want to jump in, feel free to just jump in, but also raise your hand and I can call on you too. So Renee, Christine, does that sound good to you? Okay, great. Let's kick it off with on the ballot, which is the initiative 50. So we'll start with the strength side and then we'll go to the concerns, questions side. Sound good? All right. Who wants to jump in? What do you like? What's working for you? What's a strength here? Anything you want to call out for other commission members? Go ahead, Bob. Jump in. Oh, right here, Commissioner Groff.
I do think the strength is that it would give some predictability to property owners, that they would know in a year of dramatic value increases that their taxes aren't going to go up by that much. And that somewhere behind the scenes, there's going to be that adjustment. So I do think that's a strength. It provides some stability for taxpayers.
So it goes back to that predictability piece. Go ahead, Lori.
Lori Lasky, it seems simple.
Simple, predictable. Anybody else want to add on to that? All right, switching to the kind of question. Oh, yeah.
Thank you. This just glares similarities to Prop 13. And certainly we had lots of presentations regarding hard caps and no increases and those kind of, and how difficult it has been for California to provide services with that in place. I think this is a disaster waiting to happen. I'm not sure we can afford to experiment. So.
Go ahead, Commissioner Terry.
So we as in the local government special district world, some real concerns about how this might impair any existing contracts and violate the Constitution. So that if it does not exempt out any previous Tabor elections for revenue bonds, and that can be in the metro districts, which I know a lot of people don't particularly like, but that's our development. But it could also be our park and rec districts that are, have a bond out to build a park, a pool, fire districts to build a firehouse. So there's really some concern there that it doesn't spell out one way or the other. And so therefore, several of the most respected bond counsel in Colorado, they've come together and said, whoa, this is not going to be good for us. And it is concerning the bond world. So I think that's something that we just don't have an explanation for.
Go ahead, Commissioner Oskey.
Disadvantage, simple, and it doesn't take into account increases that it may need to provide services. It's not flexible enough to work in some circumstances.
Commissioner Groff, and then we'll go Commissioner Pogue.
So I think the 4% is way too low. It's not reasonable. It doesn't even reflect inflationary factors, and we've learned inflation as it's normally measured isn't how services and the purchases of goods for services at the taxing entity level. When you look at what services they need to provide, they're far away from a 4% increase. The other thing I don't like about it is it talks about a 4% tax revenue limit as opposed to a value limit. And what we've done at the state level is we've pretty much, not that we can't change our MO, but we've concentrated on the valuation for taxation. This is now saying, no, the tax is going to be what we ultimately measure. And in measuring the tax, pretty much takes away all local government flexibility, takes away that local control that we have at the local area. And I'd be a lot more comfortable with it if it were a little higher number and it was talking about the value contribution as opposed to a cap on tax. So might be simple, but sometimes simple isn't smart.
Commissioner Pogue and then Commissioner Bick.
Thank you. I have many concerns, but one of them is that we heard loud and clear across all of the town halls that we conducted that folks want to see property tax become more of a purview of local government and less of a purview of the legislature of the state. And I think this fundamentally moves us in the opposite of that direction. I appreciate that it does create some predictability and stability, except that I don't think it actually will. I think that increasingly what we will see is local governments that cannot live with one metric across the entire state. And so we will see more local votes that create more unpredictability and a public that is increasingly frustrated by that ultimate lack of predictability.
Commissioner Vick, then Senator Hansen, and then we'll come to you. Sean.
Just building on a few comments from before, I was particularly moved by the presentation that we had from the county assessors that said any change, any one single change in this state at a statewide measure changes 4,400 and some odd calculations across the state. And so what may be seemingly simple actually is excruciatingly complicated. And I think it's important for the public to know that this is not so simple, that it is actually a quite complicated measure that plays out very differently in your own community, depending on where you are.
Senator Hansen.
Yeah, thanks. Just to add a point that we discussed earlier, I think one of the things I worry about a lot with Initiative 50 and the similarity to Prop 13 in California is there is nothing that adjusts for inflation. So we have a real and nominal problem that compounds year after year after year, and you quickly get big pieces of actual property value that are no longer in the tax base. And then that compounds, and then that compounds. And 20 years hence, we're going to have a complete separation between actual value reality, what is that thing worth, and the tax system that relies on there being a tie to actual value. So I see that as being a massive consequence of Initiative 50.
Definitely see a theme there with Commissioner Lasky as well, kind of what you were sharing on the predictability or lack thereof and what that might create. Commissioner Doherty.
Thank you, Trace. I see a slightly different problem here in the fact that if the property tax revenue is projected to grow by at least 4%, basically the Front Range is going to control the entire state on whether or not the local governments are going to be allowed to retain and spend the excess. And I've got a concern with that. If the statewide voter approval is required, the majority of residents live along the Front Range, and that leaves the more rural counties at their whim and fancy. And this state has some very, very, very different demographics throughout it. And I can't say that the Front Range is always going to know exactly what is correct or what is not correct for the more rural counties.
Anyone else want to, here we go. Yep, Commissioner Downs.
Thank you. I want to echo what Mr. Doherty just said. What I heard Mr. Hansen say was that if we exceed 4%, then the proponents of this measure believe we should reduce a statewide assessment rate, which takes us back to those days of Gallagher when we're seeing that assessment rate drops because of high growth, high value growth areas. But all of our districts that were lower than 4%, sometimes even negative, are forced to go down. So it has such a negative impact on those taxing areas that already are struggling to keep up with the demand for service. And so I think this is really detrimental in the fact that it's a statewide measure with that cap, and it will be driven by high growth areas.
Appreciate all these comments. Not seeing any more. I think just we will. Oh,
well,
I have a hand online. Go ahead, Guyleen. Sorry.
That's okay. I just wanted to echo the sentiments of the previous commissioner. I feel like we're going down to re-Gallagher land now. And if we haven't learned anything from the mistakes of the past, you should not put these numbers and formulas in the Constitution. It's just too rigid for all of the different variables that we're going to encounter. So it's a cautionary tale, but I don't know who's going to listen. But we should not be putting these formulas and numbers and percentages in the Constitution. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it. We will synthesize, just so you all know, kind of synthesize, summarize the feedback again on the pros and cons for each of these and get them back to you between now and the next meeting so that when we continue this conversation, we'll kind of pick up where we left off. So just as a note there. Renee, I'm going to turn it, or go ahead, Jonathan.
It's really quick. I agree with everything that the other commissioners have said. And it just seems so overwhelmingly not a good idea. But I want to have our retorts, I guess, or our advice sort of respond to the arguments of the proponents, right? So what are they seeing what are they trying to achieve? And then we can say, this won't for that reason. Does that make sense? So I'm just curious what the proponents of it are saying. What's so good about this idea?
We did get to hear from them directly. So yeah, so I did not set up a repeat of that for today since we did have that chance with them. But and I think that obviously feeds into the blue book too. I mean, the staff is working on, but that doesn't happen until a little bit later in the process. But I think for this commission, we are basically, I was planning on an up and down vote. Do you recommend Initiative 50 or not? Right? That's sort of the question. And we take a vote, and the result is obviously our result. So that's, I think, where we're headed next, Jonathan.
I'm seeing a head nod, so it seems like yeah.
I take back my request.
That was easy. Okay. I'm gonna move us on, and we're going through in the order, just so you all know that the memo you received from Mr. Savetsky, and that'll also be posted online as well. So online folks, if you don't have access to that, just drop it should be in your email that went out shortly before this meeting, I believe. Is that right, Matt? Yeah. So it should be in your email. And that's what I'm referencing. Yeah. So it went out in your inbox. All right. So moving on, Rennie, I'm going to hand it over to you for initiative. We're going to move on now to the petitions approved for circulation. So we're into initiative 95.
So for the title set, correct?
Yep. Title set. Yep.
So let's just take initiative 95, which in essence would amend the Constitution to require that constitutional or.
Rennie, I apologize. I think we want to do 108 before we.
Sorry. Yeah, 108. 108.
Okay.
It's just buried a little bit different. Yeah, we were just, got it.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Getting ahead here. Okay. Sets the residential assessment rate to 5.7% and sets the non-residential rate for most property classes to 24% beginning property tax year 2025. Requires that the resulting decrease in property tax revenue be reimbursed by the state. So same thing on this. What would be some strengths or pros of this particular approach? Joanne.
I have a quick question for Thomas Rosa. He should not have made the mistake of being in the room. Thomas, do you have access to your handy dandy process that you have done where you can kick out some numbers for us? So if we had a 5.7 and a 24% for everybody other than oil and gas and natural resources, and let us just assume that the mill levies would be the same, can you tell us how much less revenue that would generate? Yes, I'll give you lots of time. Thank you.
And I thank you for asking that. So this is a tool that the assessments group got to see used, and it actually can break things down by taxing jurisdiction. So in addition to a statewide impact, it could give the variation among taxing districts, and maybe we could share that on the screen or something depending on that.
And I think we did the fiscal summary, if I remember right, in the PowerPoint from Mr. Savetsky. It was 3.1 billion, if I recall, for statewide. But yeah.
Let's go with Mr. Savetsky's. I don't think, can anybody tell me what the prediction is for 2025 for total Tabor refund? And the point that I'm making is this would totally wipe out the general fund for that year if we were to backfill everything for all of the taxing jurisdictions. And if we couldn't access Tabor refunds, then we'd pretty much say, let's shut down state government for everything other than maybe Medicaid and school finance backfill.
Well, I may be able to help with this one, given my previous work on the state budget. I mean, I think there's a huge number of question marks here, but if you take the plain language of the initiative, it says you have to backfill everything.
Right.
But that becomes a shell game. So you say, oh, okay, we've lost 3 billion in revenue. So the state is going to send X billion to local governments and local districts and X billion to the school finance package, but it will be robbing the school finance package to pay the school finance package. It will be robbing Medicaid reimbursement to pay local governments. You've got to go get that amount of money, right? You're gonna have to go after the biggest parts of the budget. And so it would necessitate $3 billion in cuts somewhere to do that general fund transfer.
Go ahead, Joanne. So we start off.
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to finish my thoughts here and then I'm going to let it go. I don't on the surface of it object to lowering the commercial assessment rate. I do think at some point we have to be realistic about the residential assessment rate, because if we were to lower it by another 1%, that impact, I mean, at some point the services that are being provided will no longer be paid by the residents that are receiving those services. I just have a philosophical problem there. But even if we wanted to say 5.7 and 24 are the right numbers, I think it needs to be staggered in. I don't think we can do this kind of a change in one fell swoop. Staggered in, similar to what
with what are some concerns about this particular one, which to summarize from what I heard was, can the state actually backfill this? What would, and then Joanne, you just raised the precipitous nature of this. Was reduction in the non-residential rate. So anything else on the positive, then let's go back to concerns on this. So what would be some pros or some strengths of this approach? All right, Bob, or sorry, Senator Hansen.
Well, I guess I'll state the obvious, which is it would make us have the lowest residential rates in the country.
Right. Others, other thoughts about, yes, Commissioner Lasky.
Lori Lasky, it does at least indicate backfill for local governments.
So it promises backfill. Commissioner Donis.
And it's very simple.
And it's simple. All right. One online, Commissioner Davis.
Yeah, and again, the whole reason we're here is property tax bills have gone through the roof. So a positive to this, to pay for property taxes every spring. That's a definite positive.
Great. Commissioner Richardson.
Yeah, Cody just hit what I was. I mean, this is, we are here because concern amongst our citizens that property taxes had jumped too quickly and too abruptly, even if they are lower than across the nation. That is what we were asked to look at on their behalf. Whether it's practical, I guess we'll get into next.
So it provides tax relief. Joanne.
Yes.
I'm going to have to go. To me, the strengths are they're dealing with the value for assessment. So what is taxable? But the assumption that we're making that this will be a tax break for taxpayers doesn't necessarily carry through unless we have restrictions on the ability to set mill levies by local governments. So the first one, it's restricting revenue and it restricts revenue too much. This restricts the contribution, but it doesn't restrict revenue. And it doesn't say that taxing jurisdictions that have been given the ability to float their mill levies couldn't just go ahead and float their mill levies up to whatever they want to. So it doesn't really provide tax relief. it does provide the lowest contribution into the taxation pool of any state.
So it's reducing the base based upon the
Reduces the
assessment
base, but
rates, but
not-
not necessarily taxes, because the local jurisdictions could still ask for mill levy increases.
Correct.
All right. Other thoughts? Yes, Commissioner Richardson. Thank you.
Just that other than generally bonds and I think quite a few fire districts, there aren't a lot of floating mill levies amongst the local governments that I'm aware of. And if the people do vote to raise their levy to bring more revenue to local governance, and that is the choice they're making. So I don't see that as a negative.
Right. Thank you for that. Commissioner Terry, then we have Mr. Hansen's joined us at the table. So
I just have a clarifying question. I just want to make sure I heard that correctly. You don't think that there are many special districts that have their mill levy floating other than fire districts? There's the question mark.
Just my impression, and I may be wrong, I know quite a few fire districts de-Gallagherized, and then a lot of the bonded districts are built to float to ensure that they bring in the revenues needed. But as a percentage of property tax bills, the counties, towns, school districts being very large generally don't, is what I believe to be true.
Right. I am happy to provide you with information that, gosh, in 2018, 2020, and 2022, there are probably cumulatively over 100, 200 de-Gallagherization elections. And a lot of them, believe it or not, yes, we're fire, but we had park and rec in there and some hospital districts. So I think the headlines were fire districts and the metro districts, but they definitely go deeper than that. I just want that, and libraries, just want that for a clarification. Not trying to be combative.
No, and I'm not trying to pick on folks either. I just generally quite a few of the ones are small, very small contributions to the overall tax bill outside of the fire districts.
Commissioner Donis wanted to weigh in on this.
And I would just supplement, in addition to de-Gallagherizing, we have, in Wells County, we have a lot of special districts that have mill levies that can go up above where they are right now. So I do think it's mostly special districts.
Go ahead, Mr. Hansen.
A little late, but if it's helpful for the info, since it was asked, our estimated from our most recent forecast, size of the Tabor refund for fiscal year 25-26 would be 2.3 billion. Of that, 2.1 would be refunded through the sales tax refund mechanism.
Any follow-ups to that piece of information? Why don't we go to some concerns? So we have a lot of thoughts about some strengths of this or pros. What would be some weaknesses? We start off with backfill, effect on schools. What other weaknesses do you see?
Well, I'll go.
Okay, go ahead. Yeah, sorry, Mayor. Go
It
ahead.
just says that the state's going to reimburse all the revenue that's lost. And I'm going to ask you guys, is that even possible? No. Right?
Unless you have a money tree in your jurisdiction, I'm not sure how that's going to be possible. No, that was I think it relates to the comment I was making before. It would create kind of a shell game in a way, right? You'd meet the requirement in this initiative, but then you'd immediately have to make the exact same size cuts, and in many cases to the exact same part of the budget that you just backfilled. So school finance is a perfect example. This, I think, would result almost immediately in more than $1 billion of negative factor. So you'd move $1 billion to do the backfill, but you'd have to take it largely from the exact same area you just backfilled.
Thank you,
Joanne,
Mr.
go ahead.
Chair.
I just had a quick question because it's Friday afternoon, my brain isn't working that well. But I thought that we reimburse social services to counties as well, and that we reimburse to counties, is it 80/20? And that's statutory.
Yep.
So when you're talking about schools and having a negative factor for schools, I also see the very potential negative factor to counties where we could make up for their revenue loss on property tax, but then that 80% gets amended to 50%, which I think is what the federal government recommends.
Yeah, I mean, the number of knock-on effects here would be lengthy. I think about the exercise we went through at the beginning of COVID and the 2020 budget process, and suddenly, out of nowhere, having to find massive amounts of cuts, but cuts that are smaller than what we're contemplating with this initiative. So if you thought that episode was hard, wait for this one.
Any last comment on this before we move on to another one? All right, I don't think so. Thank you for that discussion.
All right, I'll move us on. So in addition to initiatives 50 and 108, Title Board has set titles for 9 initiatives that remain active. So we're gonna go through those 9 now. Starting with 95, which looks to amend the Constitution to require that constitutional or statutory limitations on property tax revenue take effect only if approved in an election within the local taxing authority. Start with what do you like? What are the strengths on this? Sarah Hansen.
Well, I think the obvious one to me is that it pushes the decision-making down to the local authority. And so any permanent change would have to be accepted within an individual jurisdiction.
Commissioner Groff and then Capelli.
I'm sorry, I have spent a little bit of time with these initiatives, so I hope I'm not talking too much. A positive here is the way I read the initiative. A local government wouldn't have to take this to an election to have the 4% not apply. They would have to actively go to the ballot to have the 4% apply. And as we've heard consistently, going to the ballot for local governments is pretty expensive. This would mean they would not have to incur that expense unless they wanted to comply with the 4% cap.
And I'm seeing some head nods of agreement across the commission on that one.
Yeah, I like it because it feels like it acts against as insurance almost against future initiatives. I don't think that statewide property or valuation cap, initiatives are going away, but it'd be difficult to get this rid of local control. So I like that it sort of puts a foot in the door against future unfriendly valuation reductions.
Commissioner Davis and then Commissioner Terry.
The one thing I like about this is that it has a local component. I think it's on its head. It needs to be the other way around, but I like the local component as opposed to Initiative 50, which makes it statewide.
And Commissioner Terry, go ahead.
Ditto. But I also think it really it reflects what we heard when we did the town halls around the state. And so that's an important piece, is that our citizens want things that are more locally controlled.
All right, anything else to add? Not seeing any hands. Moving to what challenges or concerns do you have as it relates to your stance on this? Commissioner Davis.
So the other side of the coin of this just seems to be, and it's a tit for tat for other initiatives that are on the ballot right now. I think the local control component should be if we want our taxes to increase more than the 4, 5, 6%, whatever the cap is, then we should go to an election rather than the way this one is set up, where it forces local governments to go to an election just to have the cap put on. So I think it should be reversed on that local component control piece.
Appreciate that. Commissioner Richardson, go ahead, and then we'll come to you. Commissioner Richardson, you're muted. Someone had to do it. It was you.
Oh, that was me. Okay. Yeah, I agree. It seems to be the reverse of what it ought to be. A little concerned that all municipalities have the ability to have people petition something to bring it on. Counties do not have that. So in this case, for counties, there isn't a mechanism for citizens to bring this to a ballot measure if they wanted to have it on there. So it's a little uneven in terms of how it could be applied across the state in different governments.
Appreciate that. Commissioner Doherty, go ahead.
So I'm not the smartest person in the room when it comes to looking at how the property taxes come in. And I'm going to ask a question, and I think Commissioner Terry could also help me with this. But if I'm reading Initiative 95 right, and there is a statewide constitutional statutory limitation on property tax revenue, in order to put that limitation, the local taxing authority would have to take it to a vote. But don't the individual districts have the opportunity to rebate if they felt the need to actually limit the amount of revenue that was coming in? I believe counties are able to do this. I don't know enough on other districts, but wouldn't the governing boards, versus having to put it on the ballot to comply with a statewide initiative or limitation, couldn't they just rebate the amount or lower the mills for a period of time?
Commissioner Terry, if you want to jump in.
Yes, they can do that. They can reduce the mills. Senate Bill 108 last year, but they could have done that before that. So yes, they can reduce it on their own. Absolutely.
So with that being said, I can't see an actual negative to this initiative because there is no real requirement to have that election if a specific district wants to lower the amount of revenues they're taking in any given year. So I'm sorry, I know you're asking for negatives right now. I'm just trying to rebut one that I thought I heard.
No, happy to have it as a dialogue. Anyone else want to jump in here? Commissioner Vick.
Just carrying out some potential consequences across the state. It could potentially run into a situation that's very similar to the things that we see across the state in school districts. Question in quality of life. So just a potential challenge, but that's democracy.
All right, any other?
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to the local government's ability to lower mills. I think we're all here because too few took advantage of that, at least as it seemed appropriate to the voters or the citizens, or we wouldn't be here. I mean, we can't, as a grouping of governments, be taking taxpayers that it is necessary and prudent to do so. And I think across the board, that was not done, or we wouldn't have seen the outcry when property values spiked and local governments collected all the taxes that came along with that spike. I think we have to admit that's why we're here. If we aren't, we're going to see the voters react at the ballot box on a lot of these measures. And then our jobs become harder. So, and they're not supposed to be easy. So I guess I'll get off my soapbox. Thanks.
Thank you. Anyone else on Initiative 95? All right, gonna move us on. Rennie, 96.
Initiative 96 would impose a tax on residential property worth at least 2 million to offset revenue reduction for property tax year 2027 and later years that results from the imposition of a statewide revenue limit on the amount or growth of property tax revenue. So thoughts on this, starting with what are the positives of this? Commissioner Pogue.
Yes, I'll go first on this one. I do think it recognized the disproportionate impacts that those high value properties have on communities. They simply require a different level of support from an infrastructure perspective. And so I think it does recognize. I think these properties also frequently can cause displacement or artificially increase the property values of a community. And so I think that this also recognizes that impact.
Thank you. Your comments for strengths, pros of this particular proposal, Senator Hansen.
Yeah, thank you. You on 96, I think, as it sits next to the discussion we just had about the measures that would cause reductions, this would reduce those reductions. So it in a sense, is a backfill for other measures. So I guess if you're really concerned about the negative factor or really concerned about impacts on the budget, this would be a way to soften those.
So it's a revenue source for backfill.
Yep.
Other thoughts on the positives of this? How about concerns with this particular approach? Commissioner Richardson. And then Commissioner Davis.
Yeah, just a little concern, though 2 million seems high today for a home, wiring it into the Constitution. Could lead
Cutting in and out on us a little bit there.
some problems down the road.
Yeah.
All right.
Could you start over? Because you broke up on us there. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, well, there's positives. I think placing the number of 2 million into the Constitution, I think sets us up for another constitutional change in 10 or 15 years. And I know that's down the road. But hardwiring that number in when we've seen values go from 300,000 to nearly 1 million in a lot of places over a decade, it doesn't, it's not unreasonable to think that $1 million homes may be $200 million or maybe $2 million homes in 10 years. And then we're levying a big increase on folks that are probably seniors and fixed income at that point, trying to stay in their homes. And it's the same problem we're trying to alleviate right now.
Thank you. Commissioner Davis.
On top of Commissioner Richardson's legitimate concerns, I actually had more of a question. I don't know if anybody can answer it, but what's the level of revenue that this would raise? Would it raise any revenue? And I'm sure it's got a component of diminishing returns in the future because it's going to start to impact the probably the value of the homes if they're taxed too high at the same point. So I don't know how effective this would be, and I'm curious if anybody in the room knows its effectiveness or it's how much revenue it actually raise.
Mr. Hansen, do you have an idea of that revenue would be raised? Thanks.
I think I got to take a look again at our fiscal summary that we wrote for this, but because it was conditional, I don't think we put a number exactly on what that would be. Should this kick in?
Is that because of not knowing the amount of the backfill or not knowing how much additional would be obtained from the $2 million plus residences?
Let me take one look and I'll report back here in just a second.
Perfect. Thanks for that. Okay. Other thoughts, Commissioner Pogue, and then Commissioner Donis.
I do share a concern similar to Commissioner Richardson's concerns. There are many counties in the state where the median single family home value is higher than 2 million. And so I do think this could impact primary home residents who have already experienced a dramatic increase in their property home values negatively. I'm not sure 2 million is the right number.
Thank you. Commissioner Donis.
And I appreciate the confidence that you all have in assessors knowing the exact market value of every property, but I do think that having a hard line of 2 million will cause some properties to be at $2,001,000, and then they'll come in and protest, and then they'll want it at 1,999,000. And so I just think that tying something directly to the exact value of a property is really risky and will most likely increase appeals. And then again, we'll change that revenue number because we're having to move properties up and down based on different complaints and comments.
So the practicality and difficulty of exact valuation. Commissioner Vick.
So going back to positives on this, I was struck by the chart that we saw where people in their lowest income brackets pay 5 times as much as people in the highest income brackets when it comes to property tax. And so positive potentially is it has a chance to rebalance that. The challenge I see though is that we want Colorado to be welcoming for all. And this potentially with this level of rebalancing, I guess, or imbalance may in fact create an imbalance in terms of incentives to be in the state. And so that's a potential challenge I see.
Great, thanks. Commissioner Doherty and then Commissioner Groff.
So I'm still trying to wrap my head a little bit around this, and just to, maybe you can tell me if what I'm thinking is correct. Let's say, just using numbers, if there was a $1 billion shortfall, if you will, on properties below, because of a cap on properties below $2 million, does that mean that $1 billion would have to be made up by all of the properties spread out equally, if you will, based upon value on all the properties above $2 million? And if that is the case, I'm not sure that I could find a faster way to tank the luxury real estate market in the state of Colorado. And I think that that is potentially irresponsible to do.
Thank you for that. David Hanson, you have an answer to that? Or
yes, probably not satisfying. We did not estimate the size of this, and that's because so just reading directly from the text, it says a supplemental tax shall be assessed and imposed by the state upon luxury residential real property in an amount sufficient to replace that reduction in revenue. So we did not particularly model it based on because we just don't know what the limit would be or what that revenue amount would be.
But to Commissioner Doherty's point, if it's only on the 2 million and they have to come up with $1 billion, that's a significant tax.
We're going to be, we're going to, as it is, there was a huge increase in property taxes on, and it was a percentage-wise higher increase on the higher valued properties, because the most recent reduction, if you will, the taking off the top, most affected the lower priced properties. And to saddle them again after, or in this respect, I think it would be irresponsible.
Thank you for that. Commissioner Groff.
So I have 2 problems. The first problem is that although intuitively we think the people that own higher value homes are people of more wealth, it really isn't linear. And you've heard some of my fellow commissioners already talking about, what if the value of that home has grown up around you, you've owned it, but your income hasn't grown at the same way your value has grown, and now you're going to get this additional tax. So intuitively it says it, but actually I don't think it's linear. I have a much bigger problem with this, is that it is meant to make up revenue. So we're going to have to go back and adjust backwards for picking up revenue from changing assessment rates or putting some kind of a tax to try and make up the money. And I'm not sure how. I mean, I really love my assessors and they do a fabulous job, but I'm really not sure how we could implement that on a statewide basis to maybe establish an additional assessment rate. I think it would be much easier Not recommending that we do it, but it would be much easier to just do a bifurcated assessment rate and say assessment rates on homes of this size are going to be that. Assessment rates on homes of that size are going to be something different. And that, but it doesn't tie it back to the revenue loss the way this is trying to do. So I just don't see a way for us to implement this graciously or simply in the state.
It's a difficulty of administration and complexity of implementation. Any other last thoughts on this before we go to the next one? All right, thank you.
We're moving on to Initiative 97. This would set most property valuations equal to the amount of their most recent sale, with subsequent annual increases limited to the lesser of the rate of inflation, or 2.5%. Properties that have not sold since June 30th, 2020 are assessed using their actual value for property tax year 2021 with the same growth limitation. Property valuations may increase more quickly if the property undergoes substantial improvement. Start on Initiative 97, strengths. What do you like? What do you want to highlight? Seeing no strengths. Okay. Moving on to the challenges, concerns, questions. Commissioner Doherty, then Senator Hansen.
Just simply, we heard from an assessor in California that this doesn't work, so I'm not sure I want to put it in place here.
Senator Hansen?
Yeah, and it's hard to add on to that. I guess I would just point out a couple of things we've already talked about. The inflation or 2.5% brings up the 4% problem, but worse. So if we have a high inflation year that's 7-8%, as we did recently, that would cause a huge divergence between tax base and actual value. And then I think this idea of turning back the clock to a previous assessment period also has a huge number of unintended consequences. And the market changes a lot in 2 years. And this Initiative 97 sort of magically says, no, it's 2020. And then we lose all the real things that have happened in the real economy, again, causing divergence between actual values and the tax base. So I think those are a couple of things that stick out for me on Initiative 97.
Thank you for that. Commissioner Richardson online.
Thank you. Yeah, I just want to put in a pitch for our assessors across the state that work very hard to come up with good valuation on individual homes. And this just sets essentially a false number. I mean, we're not, then when we're talking with citizens, we're not even talking about the actual value of their home, but some calculated value based on some past sale. We got to have some measure of reality to start with, and I think this erases it.
Speaking of assessors, Commissioner Donis.
Thank you. I have two concerns that I'd like to add to this one. One is uniformity. We'll have two properties that will be identical to each other, right next to each other, that'll have very different values and very different taxes as a result. And the second is that it impacts a new buyer more than somebody that's lived in their house for a long period of time. And oftentimes those new buyers are first-time home buyers or younger individuals that also cannot afford an excessive amount of tax. And this would be excessive on those new home buyers rather than on somebody that's been in a house for a long period of time.
Thank you for that. Any additional comments from folks before we move on? Senator Hansen.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, just looking at the time, if we don't take just a short break before we finish this off, this part of the discussion, if folks are all right with that.
I was just whispering to Christine that a break was imminent.
All right.
Why don't we finish, are we finished with Initiative 97? Okay, so perfect timing. Let's take a 10-minute break. We'll come back at,
3 o'clock?
Yeah, come back at 3.
Okay.